lights burn bright. You're blinded now, can't see the fight. Smoke and mirrors, they lead the way. Fooling hearts night after day. Welcome to the show, it's all pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end. The world's a stage, they run the flow. You clap on cue down in the front row. Painted faces, masks of stone. A hollow laugh that chills the bone. Puppets dangle strings unseen. Life's a trick, a cruel machine.
Welcome. Episode 17. This episode begins with smoke. Not so long ago, tobacco executives denied what millions were experiencing, that cigarettes and cigars were addictive and lethal. But behind the polished advertisements and iconic cowboys and ads and the camels, there was a playbook, a blueprint for making products irresistible. But what if I told you the same blueprint didn't disappear? All right, it didn't go anywhere. It quietly migrated into your kitchen, into your pantry, onto your plate, and into your cereal bowl. This is breaking the system. And today we're going to look at what we call a true crime investigation into how the tobacco industry didn't just influence the food industry, it has helped shape it into the monster of a system that it has became. Okay? By the late 20th century, tobacco was under attack, and medical research had exposed smoking's deadly toll. Litigation loomed on the companies, on the corporations, and public opinion of this matter soared and it soured against the tobacco companies. And at the same time, another industry was starting to boom, and that industry was processed foods. And so the powers that be at the big tobacco companies, they saw a major opportunity or an advantage that they could take at this time. And so we're looking at companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds. What did they start doing? Well, they began buying food companies not as what we would call casual investors, but as a strategic acquisition. And in the 1970s and 1980s, these tobacco giants bought processed food and beverage firms, including places like Kraft and General Foods, Nabisco, and the list goes on and on and on. And when Philip Morris merged Kraft and General Foods in 1987, it then became the world's largest processed food corporation. And so this wasn't a marginal sidestep, it was a corporate pivot from cigarettes, which was being pushed to the sidelines, to things like cheese curds, or cheese curls, corn pops, your breakfast cereals, your Pop-Tarts, anything and everything that you could imagine. Crackers, potato chips, all of those things. Okay? Tobacco companies didn't just buy the brands. What they done was they imported their marketing expertise, their research departments, and their sales infrastructure into, and they merged these ideas, these entities into these food companies that they were then buying. And so when we look at documents from the University of California, San Francisco's industry, the documents library show that Philip Morris directly transferred personnel, expertise, and tactics used in cigarette marketing directly to its food subsidiaries. Okay, and that comes from an article from the PMC. And so this included things like target marketing to racial and ethnic minorities, sophisticated media placement, like we're going to place media at certain times, at certain intervals during certain events, event sponsorship and grassroots ties. And the last one is branding designed to build what they would consider lifelong consumers rather than one-time buyers, right? And that's one thing with companies and corporations that are selling you something, is they don't want you to just become a one-time buyer, right? Because then you only buy the product one time and you move on and you buy a product from somebody else. They want you to be a reoccurring customer that comes back again and again and again and again, okay? They also want you to be the person or the customer that goes from buying one product to buying 2 products, 3 products, and the next thing you know, you're buying your whole household comes from this particular company or the products that they sell. So these aren't the marketing moves of what we would call mom and pop food producers. They're the legacy of experts who spent decades convincing adults not to quit smoking. Okay? Think of all of the things that they did with smoking, right? How they made it cool and hip, and how they put it in movies and in television shows and the marketing ploys and things that they did with cigarettes. All of those things then got moved into the food companies, into these food brands. So from day one, the tobacco industry knew how to, quote unquote, condition behavior. And those skills are exactly what Big Food later used to shape what millions of Americans now crave. Okay? And this brings us into the science of addiction and how that goes into food. So behind closed doors, tobacco companies were also masters of product design. Remember, they had been engineering cigarettes and cigars to maximize pleasure, to get a sensory reward, and for repeat consumption. Those same scientific approaches quietly moved into food. And a landmark study published in the journal Addiction found that between 1988 and 2001, foods owned by tobacco companies were significantly more likely to be hyper palatable, meaning they had powerful combination of things like carbohydrates, fats, and sodium, which are different types of salts, different types of flavors, that the brain registers as exponentially rewarding. Okay, so you're constantly getting that reward. And so these foods were about 80% more likely to combine carbs and sodium, and 29% more likely to combine fat and sodium compared to foods that were not owned by food companies. This isn't seasoning by accident, so to speak. This is engineered palatability that taps into the same reward circuits that tobacco industries once exploited. Okay, and the whole idea of that, you talk to a smoker, talk to a person that has smoked for years and years and years, and the majority of them will tell you that smoking is extremely addictive. I have personally known multiple people that were smokers that couldn't wait to get off work at the end of the day to light one up. They couldn't wait for break. They couldn't wait for lunchtime so that they could go out to wherever the designated smoking section was, and they could, light a cigarette or cigar up. Right? It's that addictive quality, and that's what they're putting. It's what they were, and it's what they still are putting into a lot of our foods. So next comes, when we look at anything, where is the big money? Where has the big money always been? And the big money has always been with kids. Okay. So how does the tobacco company start marketing towards kids and to what we call the vulnerable communities? Okay. Well, Big Tobacco's marketing scandals are infamous. They denied nicotine's addictiveness. They just came out and denied it. They just came out and said, oh, nicotine's not addictive, which it is, now we know. Targeting adults while skirting regulators. But when that playbook was added to food, the target expanded, especially in who? Into our children, and into communities of color, and into communities of low income, especially here in America. Okay. Internal marketing transfer included efforts to tailor branding and the messaging and the media, and it all buys into radical and ethno groups. And a controversial strategy that made tobacco-owned food brands leaders in targeted consumer outreach. Right. So basically, what they're doing is they're specifically targeting these individuals or these people because they know they can, because they know that they're going to be repeat consumers. And so when we think about this, cartoons, think of your Saturday morning cartoons, right? When we were kids growing up, we had Saturday morning cartoons, and what did we get? We went to the cupboard and we got a box of sweet, sugary cereal, right? On hot summer days, what did we do? We reached for a sugary Kool-Aid drink, right? These weren't accidents. They were products designed to create lifelong consumption habits starting when? Well, starting at childhood, right? If you can make that lifelong person, a lifelong consumer, into consuming your product not just once, not just twice, but for the rest of their life, right? You then have a $1 million investment. You're going to make millions of dollars off of individuals by making them repeat customers. Okay. And this brings us into the next segment, which is a legacy of public health harm. Today, more than 60% of calories consumed by Americans come from ultra-processed foods. And that's according to the public health experts that we now have. And that comes from a Berkeley News article on July 27th of last year. Chronic illness, once that used to be extremely rare in youth, right? Now look at it. What do we have? We have obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, right? All of those things which have done what? They've skyrocketed. And the legal world is taking notice. Just in last year, 2025, the city of San Francisco filed a lawsuit against major food corporations, including those of Kraft Heinz and Coca-Cola, alleging they knowingly engineered and marketed ultra-processed foods in ways that mirror tobacco's addiction strategies, disproportionately harming vulnerable communities. And in this case, and others like it, this frames the issue not as a personal choice, but as a corporate strategy. Once again, echoing decades of litigation against the tobacco giants. So all of the same tactics that they used when they were manufacturing cigars and cigarettes, they're throwing into the food companies, right? and they're making you an addict for life, and they know exactly what they're doing. Okay. So what does the corporate do? What does the corporate entity do? So just like the tobacco companies once denied nicotine's addictiveness, many food corporations continue to do what? They continue to deflect the same thing. They dispute definitions of ultra processed food. Like, so what is the definition of an ultra processed food? What do we consider food that is ultra processed, right? And so if we can change the definition, and they were really good at doing this during COVID and after COVID into, well, if we can change the definition of something, by right, it is no longer, the meaning no longer means that, right? So that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to dispute what constitutes something as being ultra processed. Okay, and the emphasis was really put on personal responsibility. Well, it's your responsibility, right? Me as a company, I'm not forcing my food down your throat, so to speak. That's what these corporate entities were doing. And how did they do this? How did they deny this? How did they build up this defense? Follow the money. Once again, the food tobacco companies would fund the research that would dilute such a causation, right? So when we look into, and this is any research across the board, right? You always have to look at who's funding the research. And so these food companies were in essence funding their own research to lie to us, or not necessarily lie, but try to change the definition to us, the American people, so that they're no longer at fault. But the parallels of these two things were too strong to ignore. So we have the addiction science that was used for product design. We have targeted marketing to children and minorities. We have lawsuits alleging deceptive and harmful practices. We have public health crises that are now linked to, or directly linked to, consumption patterns. So the evidence suggests we're watching history repeat itself, right? We are. History does repeat itself. And when we're talking about history repeating itself, a lot of people get the misconception that there's this big plot of history and like all of that segment of history is going to repeat itself. No, that's not the truth. The truth is when we break history down into fine little segments, those fine little segments can repeat itself again and again and again throughout history into shaping the next narrative, okay? And so this time, the shaping of the narrative, the history repeating itself, is not, or was not, with smoke. It was not with cigarettes and cigars, but it came from things like sugar and salts and fats. Okay? So I really want you to take a second and think about the things that you've consumed within the last week. How many of those things were laced with sugar? How many of those things had sugar in them? Probably a hell of a lot more than what you think, right? Or what we recognize. Sugar in itself is very, very addictive. And when we look back at how much sugar we used to consume to how much sugar we do now, the number is astronomical. Like if we have consumed more anything now than what we ever have, it's sugar. By far more. Sugar is very detrimental to your health. It leads to tooth decay, obesity, heart attacks, myocarditis, things like that. Like, sugar is very, very bad for you. Okay? Now think of salts. How many times do you add salt to the items that are on your plate, or to the items that's in your skillet that you're cooking, right? How much salt are you adding? Now, salt is good. Like, we have to have so much salt within our diet, and a lot of that comes just from the natural foods that we eat. Like, there are a lot of natural things that have salt already built into them, but we can intake just a little bit of salt. And there are different kinds of salts, right? Regular table salt is completely different from like Himalayan salt, which is also completely different than like Celtic sea salt. And all of those salts have different natural abilities because they have different natural elements in them. Okay? So the type of salt that we're using is just as important as how much salt that we're adding. And then the next thing that we look at is fats. How much fats are we getting? And not just in like what a lot of people think is like when we're cooking a steak, how much fat is in that steak? Okay? I mean, that is one example. But the type of fats too. Like, there's all kinds of different fats. Are we getting saturated fats, unsaturated fats? What form is it in? And then another one is the oils that we are cooking our foods in. Like, if we're cooking stuff that's not labeled in this ultra-processed food category where we're cooking it where it comes out of a box and we're cooking in the microwave, both of which can be very, very bad for you, okay? Like, if every meal comes out of a box and you cook every meal in a microwave, you might want to start rethinking like how you are prepping your food, because you are what you eat, okay? And unfortunately, right, and I'm not calling anybody stupid, but unfortunately, humans are stupid. Like, we like to be spoon-fed stuff. We like the easy route. And of course, things that come from a box and that can be thrown in a microwave is super, super easy and it's super convenient. But that's not the most healthy alternative. Like, there's so many other things that you could consume besides those things, right? So we need to be looking at salts, sugars, and fats. And not only in the quantity, but the type that we're consuming as well, okay? And once again, like we've talked about in some of our other episodes, anything that says that it is enriched or bleached or fortified, those are all BS jargon to get you to buy that product and because you think that it's healthy, okay? That's another corporate strategy, okay? We have to learn how to read labels and to understand what poison looks like and what new label they're giving those poisons, right? How are we ingesting those into our body? And so Big Tobacco did not invent processed food, okay? So get that out of your mind. Like, Big Tobacco didn't invent the idea of processed food, but it sure as hell helped shape it. And what began as a crisis in cigarettes transformed into a public health challenge in food, using many of the same strategies once reserved for selling Marlboros and Camels, right? And we all remember back in the day where, like, because I remember Dad smoking back in the day, and he was a Marlboro man. But, like, as a kid, like, I could go buy cigarettes and cigars from my dad, too. Like, he liked boxes of Swisher Sweets because they smelled sweet, they tasted sweet. Never smoked them, but, you know, put one in my mouth a few times. Like, I'll be honest. But they made those, it's almost like a caricature, because they wanted it not only to be addictive for your body, but they wanted you to collect things. So we look at the Marlboro Man and we look at Joe the Camel, and like, you as a consumer, you could save points, right? Just like with the the Mountain Dew bottles, the caps, and the Pepsi bottles and the Coke bottles. Like, you could collect the caps and collect points. And so, like, Pepsi and Coke got that idea from Marlboro and Camel, because you could collect the packages of cigars and cigarettes, and each one were so many points, and you could turn those points into things like special lighters and jackets and hats and race attire and different things, right? And so eventually they said, hope you guys as corporations, you can't do that because you're marketing those products towards minors, and minors, we all know, are not supposed to be able to buy and consume those products. And so the laws eventually changed that. But the story isn't over, and lawsuits continue, and research is going to continue. And as consumers, we are left to ask questions. What happens when the makers of addiction become the gatekeepers of nutrition? And as critical thinkers, which I hope you are, we critically have to be looking at, once again, like what we've said, the food that we are ingesting into our body. Because the next cycle of addiction is going to happen. History is going to repeat itself. What is the next addictive thing that they're going to add into our food when they start taking out these salts and sugars and fats, which they are doing, right? It was in the I don't remember where it was, IGA or Walmart, wherever it was the other day, and you can now get Doritos and Cheetos that have no artificial dyes, flavors, or additives or things like that. Okay, but I bet they're still addictive. So what kind of chemical property is still in there that we're consuming that's not one of those three? Because I bet they're still there, right? And so we as, like I said, critical thinkers, we have to be looking at those things, and we have to stay one step ahead of the game. Because if we don't, what does this do for us? And this is another segment that we're probably going to do down the road, where we talk about the health crisis and the insurance scam that kind of goes along with this, in that if they can control what we are consuming on the daily, and if those products are making us sick as repeat consumers, do we then become repeat consumers for the doctor and for the hospital? And the answer is yes. Yes, we do. We do become repeat consumers for those. And so then all of our hard-earned money goes towards paying off what? Doctor bills and hospital visits and pacemakers and diabetic insulin and all of these things that we could potentially be living without if we just wouldn't eat the foods that we are being hooked on. Okay? And so the reason for this episode is there's been some massive changes. I'm going to share something with you here. I believe this just came out today. Let me get my stuff situated here. In that there is a website that the government just released called realfood.gov. And here it is. And so Real Food starts here. Better health begins on your plate, not in your medicine cabinet. The new dietary guidelines for Americans defines real food as whole, nutrient-dense, and naturally occurring, placing them back at the center of our diets. Okay? So the whole idea here is that they're going to, or they are, or have redesigned the food pyramid. Okay? And so if they're redesigning the food pyramid, what does that look like? And so the idea here is that finally someone within our government sees that America is sick, and the data backs this up. Okay? So if we scroll down through this page, we can see that 50% of Americans have pre-diabetic or diabetes. It means you might not necessarily be labeled diabetic, but you're right on the edge of becoming diabetic. Okay, and as we scroll down more, we find that 75% of adults report having at least one chronic condition that is linked to the food that we are consuming on the daily. Okay, and 90% of U.S. healthcare spending goes to treating chronic disease, much of which is linked to diet and lifestyle. So 90% of the health of what we spend in healthcare, right, is because of chronic disease. Can you guys imagine if 90% of your latest doctor bill could be put back in your wallet because you have made a change in the foods that you're eating? That'd be awesome, wouldn't it? Yeah, it'd be fantastic. And as we scroll down this page some more, they give us a picture of the old food pyramid. And so for decades, we've been misled by guidance that prioritizes highly processed foods and are now facing rates of unprecedented chronic disease. Well, look at what's the bottom. What are they saying that we need the most of? Bread, cereal, rice, pasta. Okay? Well, what companies were we just talking about? What companies? Kraft, right? Kraft Foods, General Mills, all of those foods that the cigarette companies bought made the cigarettes addictive. They've made your cereals addictive. Well, what is the most amount of food that we're asking for our kids to consume? That's it. We're wanting our kids to consume the most amount of the most addictive foods, right? And so the idea here is that we're going to flip the script upside down, okay, so to speak. And so the new pyramid, let me scroll down some more, and you guys can go to this website. Like I said, it's realfood.gov. And so the new food pyramid looks something like this, where they're wanting us to focus on lots of fruits and vegetables and things that are high in protein, which helps build muscle and maintains muscle, like chicken and cheese and meats and salmon, right? And then we go down the list and they want us to focus on things like avocados and special oils and apples and strawberries and tuna and eggs. Man, you want to talk about a food that has been demonized over and over and over. Look at the egg, right? And so why was the egg demonized? And the whole idea of the egg being demonized was the idea of cholesterol, and that cholesterol is bad, and like you have to watch your cholesterol levels. That's another rabbit hole. You want to look into eggs, look into cholesterol, and how they have changed the dietary guidelines of how much cholesterol you're supposed to intake. And certain types and certain amounts of cholesterol are good for you. Like, we need cholesterol, okay? And then as we go down, like it talks about nuts and berries and bananas and rice and pudding. And then at the very, very bottom, what is at the very, very bottom? The grains, okay? And that is kind of important because when we look at the grains that we have today, the grains that are mass produced, those are not the same grains that we were producing and eating 100 years ago, 200 years ago, hell, even 50 years ago. Because of bioengineering, where we take the best trait of this grain and we take the best trait of this grain and we merge them together into this new grain, right? And we do the same thing with corn, right? In that we want the most hardiest, healthiest, the most producing stock of corn that we can possibly get. We do the same thing with grain. And the problem is, in creating this new thing that has been bioengineered, we have now created something that our bodies have a hard time digesting. And not only that, we're not getting the nutritional value out of those items that we once were. And so, like, when we look at our corn, and when we look at our grains, and we look at our soybeans and stuff that we are bioengineering, it's completely different. You're eating something completely different than what your grandparents were eating. It's not even close to the same because we bioengineered it. And which is why when we're also looking at our foods, we should also be looking at things that have been bioengineered. And we should not be buying anything that is bioengineered. Try to limit as much of that garbage, that junk, out of your diet as possible. Okay? Bioengineered is bad. Okay? And so the whole idea now is that they want us to get about 0.73 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day. So the more that you weigh, the more protein that you need. And so, like, bodybuilders and people that build meals for other people, they focus a lot of their meal prep around not only the quantity of protein, but the quality of protein that you're intaking, right? So we need to focus on things like nuts, olives, avocados, eggs, things like that. Okay. Now they want us to have 3 servings of vegetables and 2 servings of fruits per day. And they want us to have about 2 servings, maybe 2 to 4 servings of fiber-rich whole grains to help significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed, refined carbohydrates. Okay? And so, like, another thing that you can do is there's been this health revive movement in people that are buying their own grains, and they're buying their own little mini mills, right? And so they're grinding their grain down, and they're making their own breads, right? Because a lot of bread only has like 3 or 4 ingredients in it. Go to your bread aisle. Look at how many ingredients your different breads have in it. 10, 15, 20, 25, right? And those ingredients, the more ingredients you have, the worse that it is for us. Okay? So finally our nation is finding its footing again and moving past decades of unhealthy eating and rebuilding a food culture rooted in health, science, transparency, and personal responsibility. Okay? And like I said, you can scroll on down through this website and they've got some key guidance, and they've also got different resources and stuff as to what they're basing this research on, right? And I'm not saying take this at face value, just like we shouldn't take anything at face value. What should we do? Well, we should be skeptical, right? Of any administration. Doesn't matter if that administration is a Democratic or Republican administration. We should be critical thinkers and looking at this and asking ourselves, does this make sense? Is this a healthier alternative than what we're currently eating? Okay. And I hope for most of us the answer for that would be yes. Okay. So I thought that was really interesting. And that was the whole premise for the episode for today. Lost my place here. And so, once again, we need to be looking at what happens when the makers of addiction become the gatekeepers of nutrition. Okay? So once again, be a critical thinker. think for yourself, ask questions, because that's what's going to make us healthier, not only as individuals, but as a country and as a nation. Okay? Thank you for watching this episode of Breaking the System. Let's all break the system. Let's all become critical thinkers. Let's all start thinking, and let's start conversing in a manner that we can all agree with. Thank you. Appreciate it. And we'll catch you guys later.